Thank you all for having me. It is wonderful to see that the spirit still lives on. We meet here at this early hour on this day every year so as to honour the heroism, the tenacity and the resilience of that group of young men whose units were sent away to World War I. This year will also signify the 100-year anniversary of the Battles of the Somme, particularly Fromelles and Pozières. With this in mind, it is only fitting that we also remember them here today. They lived in the most harrowing of conditions, they were tenacious to the word, and they displayed great courage, especially at such a young age. Today we will remember through the eyes of one particular individual and share his plight within all of the madness and the chaos that surrounded him. He was a young draper's assistant from rural Victoria named Neil Septimus Wright, or affectionately known as Sep by his doting widowed mother. He was strong, fit, and full of youthful exuberance, as most teenagers are. And when he'd heard the call, he answered it eagerly. It is believed that he was indeed the tender age of 17 when he joined in 1914. However, his mother assisted in aiding her son's joining, as she was well aware that he would have gone with or without her blessing. Sep boarded his ship with many other young men and headed off for Egypt. They had embarked on a great adventure, and no one on the boat could have imagined what lay ahead, and probably none had considered that for some it was the beginning of their end. In Egypt, he was promoted to corporal, taken on strength at the 57th Battalion as part of the 15th Brigade, 5th Division. His initial deployment was to what was known as the nursery sector of northwestern France, with very light and sporadic fighting. However, it would not be long until the 5th Division was committed to the Battle of Fromelles, covering the period from the 19th to the 20th of July, 1916. Preparations for the attack were rushed. The Australian troops involved had very little trench warfare experience, and the power of the German defence had been significantly underestimated, with our attackers being outnumbered 2 to 1. This was his introduction to war. He was now in the midst of the most intense fighting that AIF has ever and ever will see again. We can only imagine the intense feelings for survival he would be reaching for in these soiled and squalid conditions. And all whilst attempting to maintain composure to lead the remaining soldiers in his section. I'm sure it would not have been the last time that Sep would ask himself, how did I end up here? Corporal Sep's 15th Brigade was all but destroyed within the first 15 minutes. Entire companies of infantry virtually annihilated. Their commander, Brigadier Harold Pompey Elliott, was speechless with grief the following day, tears streaming down his face as he shook hands with the lone survivors. Sergeant Jimmy Downing, a member of Sep's 57th Battalion, recalled, hundreds were mowed down in the flicker of an eyelid, like great rows of teeth knocked from a comb. Men were cut into two by streams of bullets. It seemed that it was all over in 5 minutes. Hundreds more men wounded still lay out in no man's land, and for the next 3 days and nights, Australians risked death or wounds to go out under enemy fire in an attempt to recover their brothers in arms. Looking around, Sep was a witness to people unknowingly immersing themselves in the invisible mustard gases. Invisible, yet clearly seen through the pain and fear in their eyes as they violently thrashed for breath and ultimately suffocating before him. He would marvel at the feats of aviation history passing over the top of him, but marvel would soon be turned just as quickly to fear as these platforms commenced the bombing of troops in depth. The deafening he experienced as the artillery shelling from both sides drowned out everything except the most simple of his thoughts. He could hear the thud of artillery pieces firing off in the distance. He could hear the rockets screaming through the air, and ultimately the destructive impact in his near vicinity, and no doubt the suffering they caused, voiced through the strangled cries from his comrades around him. The outcomes of the Battle of Fromelles was that it had inflicted only minor losses on the German defenders, and it had gained no ground, nor had it deflected any other German troops otherwise bound for the Somme. This was the unfortunate debut of the AIF on the Western Front. The Australian War Memorial describes this battle as the worst 24 hours in Australia's history. Of the 7,000 British Empire casualties, The Australian 5th Division sustained casualties of 5,513 killed, wounded or lost, and all in one day. In another not too far off area known as Pozières, the 1st, 2nd and 4th Divisions conducted the capture and ultimate defence of this area, and this too was at a perilous cost. The conditions at Pozières were not too dissimilar to Fromelles, albeit the duration extended to a 12-day period between the 16th and 28th of July the same year, and at a cost of 23,000 killed or wounded Australian servicemen. So between these two actions, almost 30,000 young Australians have become the casualties of war, and all in just less than a few weeks. Sepp survived Fromelles and continued to lead the remainder of his men throughout the battles of the Somme. And some 3 weeks after the 141-day ordeal, his exceptional luck dwindled momentarily. He himself sustained a gunshot wound to the shoulder and narrowly avoided becoming a permanent casualty himself. He was repatriated to England for expedient rehabilitation and then returned back to the front line and continued to fight until the remainder of the war in the worsening conditions. In total, he provided some 1,500 days of effective service, and 1,300 of those whilst operationally deployed. Somehow, Sepp survived the war, returned to Australia as a sergeant, all at the tender age of 22. Despite his age, I have no doubt he earned every stripe. He was the founding secretary of the local RSL, married, had children, and while somewhat haunted due to his service, he commenced what many would say was a fulfilling life. Due to his ongoing respiratory issues, he was precluded from joining again in World War II. However, he did receive a commission as a lieutenant in order to become the local recruiting officer. And herein lies the question for all of us to answer and ponder for ourselves. How could he, or anyone for that matter, continue to recruit knowing what he had already seen and vividly been exposed to? Sepp knew, and I too know now, that whilst tragic in nature, it was necessary to stop the spread of oppression. We all know in our bones how easily it could all happen again, how suddenly the world turns, how quickly the situation could arise, that this great country could be at the mercy of another aggressive oppression. And what then? Will we accept this and let the Anzac spirit die before us? Do we believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet so as to be purchased at the price of chains of slavery? If we treasure our freedom, our civil liberties, our freedom of speech, and indeed our very lives, then we will all need that same Anzac spirit again, typified by those brave young men and women some 100 years ago. Today we will remember Sepp, my great-grandfather, and acknowledge the fortuitous position our family finds itself in to be here, knowing how narrowly he survived at Fromelles and other significant actions throughout World War I. Today we'll remember the tremendous sacrifice at the altar by the Anzacs and the great vacuum left behind in our social fabric as they could not return to lead their own lives. Today we'll remember the commitment of all previous and current serving men, women and their families, including my own brothers in arms that have served and paid the ultimate sacrifice in the conflicts of late. Today we will remember the Anzac spirit and make a pledge to ensure that it does live on. We will remember them, lest we forget.